Do your dad and your boyfriend get along? I came home to find my fiance's $8,000 DJ setup crushed in our driveway. My dad just shrugged and said it had to be done. I screamed at him that he'd destroyed the one thing making Paxton happy during his brutal semester at MIT. Paxton had saved for 3 years and spent all his free time learning to mix as a way to decompress from quantum mechanics and advanced robotics. My dad had always been weirdly jealous of him for getting into MIT, and now he'd finally snapped. I told him he wasn't walking me down the aisle anymore, because what kind of father ruins his future son-in-law's property 2 months before their wedding? Paxton asked me for $15,000 to drop out of MIT and tour gas station parking lots as DJ Techno Vibes, my dad said, pulling out his phone to show me screenshots. The messages showed Paxton explaining that he'd already been accepted to open for some washed-up EDM artist named Glowstick Gary, who peaked in 2011 and now played rural raves in abandoned barns. Paxton had apparently been lying to me about his advanced engineering seminars when he was actually driving to Providence to play empty clubs at 2 in the afternoon for drink tickets. He'd failed his last 3 exams because he was staying up all night making what he called revolutionary dubstep that would change the electronic music scene forever. I love that kid like my own son, and I tried everything to talk him out of it, my dad said, showing me dozens of messages where he'd begged Paxton to reconsider. He'd sent him articles about MIT dropout statistics and success rates for DJs, and even offered to pay for him to do music as a summer hobby if he just stayed in school. Paxton had responded that my dad didn't understand his artistic vision, and that MIT was killing his creative soul, then sent him a video of himself practicing transitions between songs that were clearly just YouTube tutorials played at different speeds. My dad had even driven to one of his secret shows in Worcester where Paxton played to literally just the bartender who was wearing noise-canceling headphones the entire time. Listen to his SoundCloud, my dad said, playing a track that sounded like someone running a blender full of coins while a cat died in the background. The play count said 17 listens, and all 5 comments were from his mom's different accounts saying things like, "So proud," and "Next big thing." My dad explained that Paxton had already put down non-refundable deposits totaling $12,000 on touring equipment and a converted hearse painted with glow-in-the-dark aliens. He'd withdrawn from his senior thesis project claiming mental health reasons, but was actually building what he called a revolutionary bass cannon that was just speakers duct taped to a shopping cart. The only reason Paxton hadn't already dropped out was because he needed his equipment to perform, and destroying it was the only way to stop him from ruining his life since the tour started next week. He told me his stage name was going to revolutionize electronic music, but it's literally just Techno Vibes with a Z at the end, my dad said, showing me the business cards Paxton had printed with his face photoshopped onto a muscular body, crowd surfing at what was clearly a stock photo of Lollapalooza. Paxton had also been stealing electricity from the engineering lab to power his practice sessions and got caught by security playing at 4 in the morning to a janitor who asked him to please stop because the bass was making her physically ill. I couldn't let him throw away his genius for Glowstick Gary, my dad said, and I could see he meant it. I sat on the curb staring at the destroyed equipment, realizing my dad had just saved me from marrying someone who would rather be DJ Techno Vibes than an MIT graduate with a future. My dad sat next to me and showed me the email Paxton had sent to MIT's registrar saying he needed a semester off for his music career, which they'd responded to by warning him he'd lose his full scholarship if he didn't return. We looked up Glowstick Gary's tour dates, and it was just a series of CrossFit gym grand openings and memorial services where he provided ambient beats during the eulogy. The tour poster featured Gary in a mesh tank top from 2009, standing next to a fog machine that was clearly just someone vaping behind him, with venues including Gary's mom's backyard and a defunct Radio Shack parking lot. At least we put a stop to it before the wedding, my dad said, but then we heard Paxton's Uber pull up and he jumped out wearing a shirt with his own DJ logo on it. He saw his destroyed setup and fell to his knees wailing like someone had murdered his child in front of him. Then he looked up at us with tears streaming down his face and pulled something from his pocket. "I can't believe you did this right when Skrillex just agreed to listen to my demo," he said, holding up his phone. The message was from someone saved as Skrillex's manager, and it just said, "New phone, who dis?" I grabbed Paxton's arm and pulled him up from the driveway because Mrs. Taylor from next door was already recording everything on her phone from behind her rose bushes. Dad took Paxton's other arm, and we basically dragged him toward the house while he kept waving his phone around and screaming about his destroyed future. His whole body was shaking, and pieces of broken circuit boards were falling from his hands, leaving a trail across the lawn. The front door slammed behind us, and Paxton collapsed onto our couch, still clutching what looked like half of his mixer against his chest like a broken baby. He started ranting about how we'd ruined everything and cost him his shot at fame while completely ignoring the fact that he was about to throw away his MIT degree for some guy who played memorial services. I watched him rock back and forth on the couch and realized he wasn't even hearing us anymore. His phone kept buzzing, and I saw he'd already posted 3 Instagram stories in the Uber, showing the destroyed equipment with captions calling my dad a dream killer and tagging every EDM artist he could think of. The tags were mostly just Glowstick Gary and some sophomore who played laptop sets at frat parties. I told him he needed to stop posting about this right now and think about what he was doing, but he just kept typing on his phone with tears running down his face. Dad tried to take the phone away, but Paxton jumped up and said he was going to stay with his DJ friend who actually understood art and creativity. 20 minutes later, he texted that he was at some freshman's dorm room where the kid had a MIDI keyboard and they were going to rebuild his entire setup from scratch. I let him go because I needed time to process everything Dad had shown me about the money and the lies and the failing grades that Paxton had been hiding from me for months. That night, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as Paxton's posts started spreading through our friend group. Some people were calling Dad controlling and crazy for destroying the equipment, while others were sharing their own stories about Paxton trying to get them to invest in his tour or buy tickets to shows that never never happened. My college roommate texted that Paxton had asked her for $3,000 last month to help fund his bass canon project. Another friend said Paxton tried to sell him studio time in a recording space that turned out to be the MIT computer lab after hours. The messages kept coming asking if we were still getting married and whether the wedding was on, and I finally just turned my phone off completely. Dad made us tea, and we sat at his kitchen table while he pulled out a folder he'd been keeping about the whole situation. He admitted he'd always been a little jealous of Paxton getting into MIT when he never got to go to college himself because his family couldn't afford it. But he kept insisting this wasn't about jealousy, but about protecting both of us from financial disaster, and Paxton from throwing his entire life away for a fantasy. The folder was thick with screenshots and printouts and bank statements showing everything Paxton had been doing behind my back. I spent the next 3 hours going through every piece of evidence while Dad sat quietly next to me. There were screenshots of Paxton's course failures showing Fs in 3 classes and incomplete grades in 2 others. Emails from professors asking where he'd been and why he hadn't turned in assignments for weeks. Bank statements showing $12,000 in tour deposits paid to sketchy companies with names like Epic Bass Productions and Revolutionary Sound Systems LLC. The worst part was finding a draft email on his MIT account, where Paxton was planning to tell me about dropping out only after the tour started, when it would be too late for anyone to stop him. The email said he knew I'd try to talk him out of it, so he had to wait until he was already on the road with Gary to reveal his new career path. My phone rang at midnight, and it was Paxton calling from his friend's dorm, sounding slightly calmer, but still completely delusional. He kept insisting this was about art versus control, and that MIT was crushing his creative soul and killing his passion for music. When I brought up the $12,000 he'd already lost in deposits, he said that was just the price of following your dreams, and that I wouldn't understand, because I'd never taken a real risk in my life. That's when I realized how far gone he really was, if he thought losing that much money was just part of the artistic process. After we hung up, I packed a bag with my clothes and laptop because I couldn't face going back to our apartment full of wedding stuff and his music equipment scattered everywhere. I lay awake in Dad's guest room making mental lists of everything that needed to be dealt with, including the wedding venue and the apartment lease and our joint bank account that Paxton had been draining for equipment purchases. Well, nothing says meet the parents quite like Dad turning $8,000 of DJ equipment into the world's most expensive driveway gravel, though I have to admit, DJ Techno Vibes with a Z is the kind of creative genius that really makes you question that MIT scholarship. The next morning, I woke up early and called MIT's Student Support Services to schedule an emergency appointment for Paxton with someone who could help him. The receptionist transferred me to academic advisor Adrienne Holbrook, who said she could see him that week if he was willing to come in. I hung up and immediately called our wedding venue because we only had 8 weeks until the ceremony, and I needed to know our options. The coordinator picked up on the 3rd ring and pulled up our file while I explained we might need to postpone. She told me we had exactly 1 week before losing the $5,000 deposit, but she could move us to next year if we decided before then. She said she'd seen plenty of pre-wedding crises, but admitted nothing quite like my fiancé thinking he's the next Skrillex. I thanked her and wrote down the deadline on Dad's kitchen calendar while he made us both coffee. My phone buzzed with a call back from Adrienne Holbrook, who'd reviewed Paxton's academic record after my earlier message. She explained he was facing academic probation with 3 failed courses and 2 incompletes, but could potentially salvage his scholarship with summer courses. She'd seen this pattern before with overwhelmed students who escaped into fantasy careers rather than face their academic struggles. The scholarship committee would give him 1 more semester if he maintained a reduced course load and attended mandatory counseling sessions. I texted Paxton about the advisor meeting while Adrienne was still explaining the requirements. He responded immediately that he couldn't make it because he had a set at someone's house party that night. When I pointed out his equipment was destroyed, he said he'd DJ from his laptop, which showed he still wasn't grasping reality. Dad's friend Everett Land called that afternoon after Dad told him about the situation. Everett did mediation work and offered to help us navigate the legal aspects of the destroyed equipment and financial mess. He explained that while Dad could face property damage liability, Paxton's fraud about his education might complicate any legal action. He suggested we document everything and try mediation before anyone filed lawsuits or pressed charges. My phone started blowing up with notifications as Paxton's mom went on a social media rampage defending him. She was calling us dream crushers and sharing his SoundCloud links saying he was a misunderstood genius who didn't need college. I posted one neutral statement that we were working through some challenges and then went completely silent online. That night, I sat alone in Dad's guest room with good headphones listening to Paxton's tracks trying to hear what he heard. There were moments that showed he understood rhythm and had some creative ideas buried under amateur production, but the drops would clear any dance floor instantly, and the transitions sounded like someone learning from YouTube tutorials. The next morning, I drove to Worcester to find the bar where Dad had seen Paxton perform. The bartender remembered the show immediately when I described it and started laughing. She confirmed it was just her and one drunk guy who kept requesting country music while Paxton played his full 2-hour set. She said he'd been so serious about it like he was playing Madison Square Garden to an empty room. It broke my heart a little hearing her describe how he'd announced each song to nobody and done stage banter between tracks. On the drive back, Paxton's mom called me crying about how I needed to support his dreams like she did. She kept saying not everyone could be a corporate drone and that creative souls needed nurturing, not destruction. I gently pointed out that creating fake SoundCloud accounts to comment on his music wasn't support, but enabling. She screamed that I was just like my dad and hung up on me. 2 days later, Paxton showed up at Dad's house with papers he'd printed from the internet. He'd downloaded a cease and desist template and filled it out himself, threatening to sue for destruction of property. Everett looked it over when he came by and said it wasn't legally binding, but showed Paxton was escalating rather than accepting reality. Dad sat down with Paxton and offered to pay for the destroyed equipment through official vendor refunds only. He wouldn't give cash directly, but would pay vendors if Paxton canceled the tour and attended the academic advisor meeting. It was a fair compromise that protected Paxton from himself while taking responsibility for the destruction. Paxton's face turned red, and he crumpled up the fake legal papers before storming out without saying anything. 5 minutes later, Paxton came back through the front door dragging a duffel bag and demanded we give him the full $8,000 in cash right now with no strings attached. He said we were trying to control him with money just like everyone else who didn't understand real art. Dad stood up from the couch and told him the offer was equipment refunds through vendors only, not cash, and Paxton's face got even redder than before. He kicked the coffee table hard enough to knock over Dad's mug and yelled that we'd regret this when he became famous without our help. Then he pulled out his phone and showed us a text from Gary saying he could borrow his backup equipment for the tour that started in 4 days. Paxton said he didn't need us or our money because Gary believed in him, and that was all that mattered. He grabbed his duffel bag and stormed out again, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall shook. Dad and I just sat there staring at each other, both of us knowing this wasn't over yet. I opened my laptop and found Gary's booking email address on his terrible website that looked like it was made in 1998. I sent him a message pretending to be interested in hiring him for a corporate event, asking about his availability and rates. Within an hour, he replied with the saddest booking information I'd ever seen. The tour Paxton was so excited about was literally 3 gigs total, one at a vape shop grand opening, one providing background music at a pet funeral, and one at someone's divorce party in their backyard. Gary's rate was $200 per event plus gas money, and the contract he'd sent Paxton meant Paxton owed him $500, whether he showed up or not. I showed Dad the email, and we both realized Paxton was about to lose even more money on this disaster. That evening, after we'd eaten takeout in silence, I finally asked Dad if destroying the equipment had really been the only way to handle this. He put down his fork and looked at me with tired eyes, admitting he should have talked to me first before taking such a big step. He said he'd panicked when he saw how far gone Paxton was, and just reacted instead of thinking it through. We'd both messed up in different ways, him by destroying property, and me by not seeing the warning signs earlier. At least now we were trying to fix things together instead of making it worse. The next morning, I called our wedding venue to deal with the deposit situation before we lost $5,000. The coordinator was surprisingly understanding when I explained we needed to postpone due to personal issues. She offered to hold our date for next year with no extra fee, which felt like the first good news we'd had in days. I accepted the offer even though I had no idea if we'd actually use it, but at least it bought us time to figure things out. That afternoon, I sat at Dad's computer and typed out a long email to Paxton laying out exactly where things stood. I told him the wedding was officially postponed. I was staying with Dad for now, and I would only talk about our future after he dealt with his school situation. I needed to see real action like attending classes and meeting with advisors, not more promises about his music career taking off. I sent it and immediately felt both relief and sadness washing over me. 3 days passed with no response until Paxton finally texted saying he'd go to the advisor meeting if Dad gave him $2,000 for living expenses. We both knew he meant tour expenses, but after arguing about it for hours, Dad agreed to pay bills directly to landlords and utilities, not give him cash. Paxton sent back a bunch of angry texts, but eventually said fine, he'd take what he could get. Everett came over that weekend and helped us set up a formal mediation session at his office downtown. We all sat around a conference table while Everett wrote up an agreement on his laptop. Dad would pay vendors directly for verified wedding and school expenses only. Paxton would cancel the tour and start counseling, and everyone would stop the social media attacks immediately. It felt like we were negotiating a peace treaty between warring countries, not trying to save a relationship and someone's education. Paxton signed it, but I could see in his eyes he was only doing it for the money. The meeting with Adrian the next week was even more tense than the mediation. Paxton sat there with his arms crossed, insisting MIT didn't understand creative minds and that Einstein probably would have failed there too. Adrian stayed patient, pulling up his transcript and explaining his 3 options clearly. He could take incompletes and make up the work over summer, drop some classes and retake them next semester with a reduced course load, or lose his full scholarship completely. She showed him the math on paper, how much debt he'd have without the scholarship, and I saw his face go pale when he realized it was over $200,000. He finally stopped arguing and actually took notes on what he needed to do to save his academic career. That same night, I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw Gary had posted about his upcoming tour featuring special guest DJ Techno Vibes spelled with a Z. Paxton had shared it immediately with fire emojis and comments about revolutionary bass drops. Gary's tour lineup reads like a playlist of life's most awkward moments. Nothing screams revolutionary bass drops, quite like providing the soundtrack to someone's goldfish funeral or spinning tracks while Karen signs her divorce papers in the backyard. My heart sank because I realized he still hadn't let go of the fantasy even after everything we'd been through. This was going to be a much longer process than any of us had hoped. That weekend, I borrowed Dad's truck and drove to our apartment to pack up my essential stuff. I filled boxes with clothes, my laptop, work files, and some photos from before all this started. The place was full of half-finished wedding decorations we'd been making together. Mason jars with ribbon and dried flowers that now just looked sad. Paxton wasn't there, probably at Gary's practicing with the borrowed equipment. I left him a note on the kitchen counter saying we needed space to figure things out and that I'd be at Dad's if he wanted to talk about real solutions, not DJ dreams. 3 days later, Dad picked up his phone and dialed Paxton's number while I watched from the couch. He cleared his throat and started talking about how Paxton had real talent for engineering and problem solving, just not for being a DJ. I couldn't believe Paxton didn't hang up right away like he usually did. They talked for 20 minutes about the robotics project Paxton built last year that won some campus competition. Dad kept his voice calm and steady, telling Paxton he could still have a great future if he just focused on what he was actually good at. After the call, Paxton texted me that he'd cancel most of the tour, but needed needed to do the divorce party gig as his farewell show. I texted back that this broke our mediation agreement and the financial support would stop. He sent back 5 angry messages calling me unsupportive and saying artists needed closure to move on. Everett drafted a formal notice on his legal letterhead explaining that breaking the agreement meant Dad didn't have to pay anything. He sent it by certified mail and email to make sure Paxton got it. I added my own message that the wedding wouldn't be rescheduled until he followed every part of our agreement. Paxton called me crying and yelling, but I held firm. The divorce party happened anyway that Saturday night at some barn outside Worcester. Videos started popping up on Instagram showing Paxton playing loud EDM to a crowd of older people in cowboy boots. Someone's grandma walked up to his setup and asked him to turn it down because it was giving her a headache. The bride's father unplugged his equipment halfway through his set. People were laughing and recording as Paxton tried to explain his artistic vision to drunk country music fans. At 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Paxton that just said, "I'm sorry," with no emojis or excuses. It felt more real than anything he'd said in weeks. Monday morning, Adrienne called with good news about an academic recovery plan she'd worked out with the department. Paxton could drop 1 class completely, take incompletes in 2 others, and make them up over summer while getting counseling. His scholarship would be reduced by 30%, but not eliminated entirely. She emailed us the detailed plan with all the deadlines and requirements highlighted. Paxton had to maintain a B average in his remaining classes and attend weekly counseling sessions. We met at a Starbucks downtown the following week to talk about everything. Paxton looked smaller sitting across from me, like all that DJ confidence had leaked out of him. We both ordered coffee and sat there stirring it without drinking. He said he needed a break until the semester ended to figure himself out. I agreed we should take time apart and see how we felt after finals. We both cried a little, not dramatic sobbing, but just tears sliding down while we talked. Back at Dad's house, I set up new routines and boundaries about not talking about Paxton every meal. I found a counselor through my insurance who specialized in relationship issues and started going twice a week. Dad surprised me by signing up for his own sessions to work on his tendency to fix problems with big dramatic gestures. We ate dinner together most nights but talked about work, the news, anything except Paxton and the wedding mess. Everett helped file all the paperwork to officially close out the legal issues from the destroyed equipment. Paxton took down all his social media posts about Dad being a dream killer after Everett explained he could face defamation charges. Dad agreed not to report the electricity theft from MIT that Paxton had admitted to during one of his rants. Everyone just wanted this chapter done and over with. The wedding vendors got their payments directly from Dad as we'd agreed in mediation. He managed to recover about $3,000 from deposits by explaining the situation and asking for partial refunds. Paxton got a job at the campus bookstore working 20 hours a week at minimum wage. He texted me photos of him wearing the uniform polo shirt and name tag, trying to make jokes about it being his new performance outfit. It wasn't much money, but at least it was real income based on actual work instead of fantasy DJ bookings. The venue coordinator called to finalize the wedding postponement and offered to hold partial credit toward a future date if we decided to use it. We lost about $2,000 in non-refundable deposits for catering and flowers that had already been ordered. It hurt to lose that money, but it was better than going through with a wedding when we didn't even know who we really were anymore. I signed up for the photography class at the community center that Thursday, walking in with my camera bag and finding a seat in the back row where 12 other people were already setting up their equipment. The instructor showed us basic composition rules and had us practice taking shots of ordinary objects from different angles, and I spent 2 hours focused on aperture settings instead of wedding disasters. Paxton texted me a photo of him sitting in the counselor's waiting room with just the words, "Appointment 1 done," and nothing else, which felt more real than any of his usual long messages about changing his life. I went to class twice a week and started carrying my camera everywhere, taking pictures of morning light through coffee shop windows and rain puddles reflecting street signs. Dad bought me a new lens for my birthday, and we spent Saturday afternoon at the park while I practiced depth of field shots, and he read his book on a bench nearby. Paxton kept sending his updates exactly as we'd agreed, just facts like turned in lab report or went to all 3 lectures today, with no extra commentary or promises. I printed out my best photos from class and hung them in Dad's guest room, creating a wall of images that had nothing to do with DJs or weddings or MIT. 6 weeks passed with this new routine, and Adrienne called to confirm Paxton had completed all his makeup assignments and maintained a B average in his remaining classes. She said his partial scholarship would continue for fall semester if he kept meeting requirements, and while his grades weren't stellar, he was passing everything and showing up consistently. Dad and I went to our joint counseling session where we sat on opposite ends of a beige couch while the therapist asked us about communication patterns. Dad admitted he should have talked to me before destroying the equipment, and I said I'd been ignoring red flags about Paxton for months because I wanted the wedding more than I wanted to see reality. The therapist had us practice using "I feel" statements, and Dad made a joke about at least not using a sledgehammer that made us both laugh for the first time in weeks. I drove to our old apartment with boxes and packing tape, working through each room methodically while Paxton was at class. The wedding decorations went into one box, his remaining music cables and adapters into another, and I kept just one photo from 2 years ago when we'd gone camping and he'd been excited about his robotics project instead of bass drops. The apartment felt empty without all his equipment taking up half the living room, and I left my key on the counter after loading everything into my car. Paxton sent me a flyer for his campus coffee shop performance, just him with an acoustic guitar and his laptop doing a 30-minute set between other student performers. I didn't go, but heard from a mutual friend that people clapped politely and gave him real feedback about his rhythm being off in places, and he actually wrote their suggestions down in a notebook. Dad made reservations at our favorite Italian place downtown, where we'd gone for special occasions since I was 12, and we ordered our usual dishes while finally able to laugh about some of the absurd parts. We joked about the alien hearse and how Gary's fog machine was definitely just someone vaping, and Dad showed showed me the Skrillex manager text again, which made us both crack up over our pasta. The waiter brought tiramisu with a candle, even though it wasn't anyone's birthday. And Dad said he was proud of how I'd handled everything, even if his methods had been extreme. 3 months after that day in the driveway, I was unpacking dishes in my new studio apartment near downtown, hanging my photography on the walls and setting up my desk by the window with good light. My job had given me a small raise, and I could afford the place on my own, with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom where I didn't have to step over DJ equipment to reach the shower. Paxton passed his summer classes with 2 Bs and 1 B-, which Adrian said was enough to maintain his reduced scholarship for senior year. He texted asking if we could get coffee after his finals to talk about everything that had happened, not as DJ Techno Vibes and his biggest fan, but as 2 people who'd lost their way and were trying to find it again. I agreed to meet him at the Starbucks near campus, the same one where we'd talked about taking a break 3 months earlier. We sat across from each other with our drinks, both of us different from we'd been before, him without his DJ confidence and me without my wedding planning binders. He talked about his counseling sessions helping him understand how he'd used music to escape academic pressure, and I told him about my photography class and how I'd forgotten what it felt like to have my own interests. We didn't make any decisions about our future that day, just agreed to stay in touch and see what happened when fall semester started, and we both had more time to figure out who we actually were without the crisis and drama. Man, time really does fly when you're not planning alien-themed weddings, huh? Thanks for hanging out and watching things drift back down to earth with me. I'll catch you next time. And hey, subscribe for more content like this.